There was a man in Moscow in 1973. His name was Anatoly. He was not a spy. He was a psychologist. And his job was to break people. Not with violence, not with threats, with something far more precise. He had spent 11 years studying a single question. What is the exact point at which a human being stops being themselves? He had found the answer, and the answer terrified him. Because it wasn't hidden deep inside a person, it was right at the surface, completely exposed, available to anyone who knew where to look. He wrote his findings in a classified report that would not be seen outside the facility for nearly 2 decades. The report was titled, "On the Architecture of Psychological Resistance," and what it concluded was that there existed a specific set of mental conditions that made a human being effectively impossible to manipulate. Not difficult, not resistant, impossible. The people who possessed these conditions could sit across a table from the most skilled interrogator in the program and walk away unchanged. Not because they were cold, not because they had no needs, but because they had developed something the report called the internal mirror, a psychological structure so stable, so self-referencing, so accurately calibrated to reality, that external manipulation simply had nothing to grip. It slid off like water off glass. Anatoly spent the rest of his career trying to understand how some people were born with this structure and whether others could build it. What you are about to hear is what he found. This is not a story about dark psychology used against you. This is the story of dark psychology turned inside out. This is the manual for becoming someone the techniques cannot reach. Before we go further, there are 42 specific psychological techniques documented in the Soviet intelligence training archives that have been partially declassified since 1991. 42 distinct methods for breaking down, rerouting, and controlling human thought, emotion, and behavior. We are going to discuss the ones that matter most today, not as threats, as blueprints. Because understanding how a lock works is the only way to understand how it cannot be picked. Anatoly's report began with a simple observation. Every human being carries 2 mirrors. The first is the external mirror, the reflection that comes from other people, from their approval or disapproval, from their perception of you, from the image they hand back to you about who you are. The second is the internal mirror, the reflection that comes from inside, from your own accumulated self-knowledge, from the record of your own actions measured against your own values, from the quiet voice that speaks when no one else is in the room. Most people, Anatoly found, rely primarily on the external mirror, not because they are shallow. Because the external mirror is louder, more immediate, more concrete. When someone you respect tells you that you did something well, that information arrives faster and more vividly than any internal assessment you might construct. The problem is this. The external mirror can be controlled by whoever controls the people whose opinion you rely on. If your sense of who you are depends primarily on how others reflect you back, then the person who controls the reflection controls you. This was not Anatoly's original insight. It was the operational foundation of the psychological manipulation program he worked within. The entire system was built on the assumption that the external mirror was dominant in most people, and that the internal mirror was either absent or too weak to function as a counterweight. His contribution was different. He was studying the exceptions, the people who did not collapse, the people who sat in the room, absorbed everything coming at them, and came out the other side holding the same sense of themselves they had walked in with. What was different about them? Not their intelligence. The program had broken very intelligent people. Not their emotional strength. Some of the most emotionally expressive subjects were the most resistant. Not their political conviction. True believers collapsed as often as cynics. What was different was the condition of their internal mirror. It was clean. It was calibrated. It was actively maintained. And it was real. Not idealized, not inflated, not defensive. Accurate. They knew who they were. Not perfectly, but specifically. They had what Anatoly described in his report as integrated self-knowledge, a picture of themselves that incorporated both their strengths and their failures, both their values and their contradictions, both who they were in their best moments and who they became under pressure. a self-knowledge that was honest enough to be stable, because a self-concept that is artificially inflated will shatter the moment reality contradicts it. And a self-concept that is honest can absorb reality without losing coherence. The manipulation program could not touch these people, because the techniques all worked by feeding distorted information into the external mirror. And for someone whose primary reference point was internal, the distortion simply didn't compute. They heard it, they evaluated it, and they placed it next to what they actually knew about themselves. It didn't fit, so they set it aside, not defensively, calmly. The way you set aside a map that clearly does not match the territory you are standing in, what does this mean for you today? Let me be specific. Right now, in your daily life, there are multiple systems operating simultaneously that are attempting to function as your external mirror. Your social media feed shows you a carefully curated version of how your community perceives you. Your workplace feedback systems give you a specific, filtered picture of your professional value. Your political media environment tells you a story about who people like you are and what people like you believe. Your advertising environment tells you a story about what you lack and what would make you whole. None of these systems has any interest in giving you an accurate reflection. Each of them has a specific interest in giving you a reflection that serves their objectives. And if your sense of who you are depends primarily on what those systems show you, then those systems are, in the most literal sense, holding the remote control to your emotional life. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an engineering reality. The systems were built to function this way. And the first step toward becoming psychologically untouchable is understanding that this is happening, naming it, seeing it, because you cannot build an internal mirror while you are constantly looking at the external one. Here's something that Anatoly's research confirmed, and that every significant psychological tradition, from Carl Jung forward, has also documented. The psychological weaknesses that manipulation exploits are almost always the parts of ourselves we refuse to look at directly, the aspects of our character we have labeled unacceptable, the impulses we pretend we don't have, the fears we have decided are too threatening to examine, the failures we have buried rather than processed. Anatoly called these blind spots in the internal mirror, places where the self-knowledge has a gap. And wherever there is a gap in the internal mirror, the external mirror has a foothold. Because the gap is a place where you cannot evaluate incoming information against your own self-knowledge. You have no reference point. You are dependent on what others tell you about that part of yourself. And whoever controls what you are told about that part controls you in that territory. Here's a concrete example. A subject in the program had a deep, largely unexamined shame around his own capacity for dishonesty. He thought of himself as an honest man. He was, in most situations, genuinely honest. But there was a period in his past where he had done something he was not proud of. He had never truly examined it. He had simply buried it, and then told himself the story that he was an honest man and moved forward. The case officer assigned to him learned about the buried event and spent 3 weeks dropping small, precisely placed suggestions that implied the officer saw through the subject's self-presentation. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory, just the subtle implication that the case officer could see what the subject had worked so hard to hide. Within 3 weeks, the subject was in a state of profound psychological instability. The shame had been activated. The gap in the internal mirror had been exploited, and the case officer now had leverage precisely in the territory where the subject had no stable self-knowledge to defend with. The resolution was not pleasant. Anatoly observed the case from the outside, and he wrote in his report, if the subject had looked directly at this part of himself, had examined it, sat with it, integrated it into his complete self-picture rather than burying it, there would have been nothing to exploit. What we used against him was not the event itself. It was the gap it had created. The gap was the weapon. We simply used it. This is what psychological traditions call shadow integration, the process of looking directly at the parts of yourself you would prefer not to see. Not to condemn them, not to excuse them, but to know them. Specifically, to close the gaps, to give yourself a complete, accurate picture that includes everything, the heroic and the shameful, the generous and the self-serving, the principled and the contradictory. When you know your own shadow, no one can use it against you. because there is no gap for them to stand in, no blind spot where their version of you can be installed without your noticing. You have already put something there, your own honest assessment. And your honest assessment, however uncomfortable, is infinitely more stable than whatever story someone else wants to tell you about yourself. How do you actually do this? Not through dramatic confession or public disclosure, not through endless therapy sessions that rehearse the past without resolving it, through a specific private practice that Anatoly described as the accounting. You sit alone, with no device, no distraction, no audience, and you make a list. Not of your virtues, of the things you have done that you are not proud of. The specific ones, not categories, incidents. You describe each one with the same factual neutrality you would use to describe something that happened to someone else. You do not explain. You do not justify. You do not condemn. You simply describe. And then you sit with the description. You acknowledge that this is part of who you are, that this specific action came from a specific impulse or fear or want that is part of your character. You do not need to share this with anyone. You do not need to resolve it publicly. You simply need to know it. Privately, specifically, honestly, because once you know it, it cannot be held over you, because you are already holding it yourself. Soviet intelligence used the information vacuum as an attack weapon. Create a gap in what the target knows. Let their anxiety fill it. Control access to the resolution, and therefore control the target. The inversion of this technique is one of the most powerful tools available for psychological self-defense. It works like this. When you notice that you are experiencing anxiety about something you don't know, instead of seeking to fill the gap with whatever information is most immediately available, you deliberately sit with the gap. You notice the anxiety. You name it specifically, and you ask one question. Who controls access to the information I feel I need right now? And what do they gain by my needing it? This sounds simple. In practice, it is profoundly difficult. Because the anxiety produced by an information gap is not a mild discomfort. It is an acute psychological state. It activates the same neural circuits as physical threat. It produces the same urgency, the same compulsion to act immediately, to resolve, to fill. The person who can pause in that state, who can notice the urgency without immediately acting on it, who can hold the question long enough to evaluate who benefits from their anxiety. That person has broken the manipulation loop at its first point of contact, before it has any purchase, before it has produced the compulsive behavior it was designed to produce. Think about how this applies to the specific information sources in your daily life. Your news notification tells you something urgent has happened. It does not tell you what. You feel the pull, the immediate need to know, the anxiety of the gap. Pause. Who controls access to that information right now? What do they gain from your immediate, anxious engagement? What would you lose by waiting 30 minutes to evaluate the information in a less activated state? Usually, nothing of consequence. But in 30 minutes, your cortisol will be lower. Your prefrontal function will be higher. Your capacity to evaluate what you are reading will be significantly better. And the information, if it is genuinely important, will still be there. The information vacuum technique loses most of its power. The moment you stop moving from anxiety to action automatically, the moment you build a deliberate pause between feeling and behavior, that pause is not passivity. It is the exercise of agency. It is the single most effective behavioral change available for reducing your susceptibility to information-based manipulation. And it can be built with practice, like any other capacity. The technique called love bombing works because it exploits a genuine need, the need to be seen, understood, valued at a specific, particular level of depth. The exploitation does not work by manufacturing that need. The need is real. It works by offering a counterfeit satisfaction of it, at a neurological intensity that creates dependency before you have had time to evaluate whether the satisfaction is genuine. The immunity to this technique is not the elimination of the need. That would be the wrong conclusion. The need to be deeply known is not a vulnerability to be eliminated. It is a human necessity to be honored and met through genuine relationship. The immunity is the development of a specific, calibrated sense of what genuine understanding actually feels like. so that the counterfeit version can be recognized for what it is, before the dependency forms. Here's the diagnostic. Genuine understanding of another person takes time, not because people are complicated, because understanding requires observation across multiple contexts, multiple emotional states, multiple kinds of pressure, multiple moments of disagreement and misalignment. A person who seems to understand you completely within the first weeks of a relationship, who reflects your worldview back at you with extraordinary precision from almost the first conversation, has not genuinely understood you. They have learned your language. Understanding what someone says is not the same as understanding who they are, but it produces a similar feeling in the moment. And that feeling is the entry point. The KGB trained its long-term deep cover operators specifically in this technique. The selection criteria for officers assigned to operations requiring intimate-level access to targets included a specific psychological capacity, the ability to rapidly identify and mirror another person's self-narrative, the story they tell about themselves, the way they frame their own values, fears, and motivations, the language they use for the things that matter most to them. An operator with this capacity could produce, in the first 3 conversations, the sensation in a target that the operator understood them better than anyone they had ever met. That meeting this person was somehow significant, fated, that the relief of being so immediately known was something they did not want to let go of. The dependency was forming before the target had any information about the operator that would allow evaluation. The defense is not suspicion, not the reflexive rejection of all connection. The defense is patience, the deliberate decision to allow understanding to develop at the pace that genuine understanding actually develops, which is slower than the pull, always slower. The pull towards someone who seems to understand you completely is faster than the process of actually verifying whether they do. Your job in that gap between the pull and the verification is to stay conscious, to feel the pull, to not mistake it for confirmation, and to allow time to do what only time can do. Reveal whether what feels like understanding is understanding or is performance. Here's a question worth sitting with. Can you identify 3 significant beliefs you currently hold that are not held by any of the people in your immediate social environment? Not minority beliefs globally, but beliefs where you are the outlier in your specific community, where your view is different from the people you spend the most time with, where you hold a position that requires you to be, in some meaningful way, alone. If you cannot immediately identify any such beliefs, that is itself important information, not because you are wrong about everything you believe in common with your community, but because a completely socially synchronized belief system is almost certainly not entirely independently derived. Some of what you believe because you worked it out. You observed, evaluated, concluded, but some of what you believe because the social cost of believing otherwise in your community felt prohibitive. And the manufactured consensus technique works precisely by making the cost of your independent perception feel unbearably high. The defense requires developing what researchers in political psychology have called belief-holding comfort, the capacity to hold a position that appears to be held by very few other people, without the psychological distress that ordinarily drives conformity. This capacity is not stubbornness. It is not contrarianism. It is the willingness to sit with social discomfort long enough to distinguish between 2 different sources of an urge to change your mind. The first source is new information. You have encountered evidence or argument that genuinely challenges your previous position. Your view should change in response to this. Changing your mind in response to genuine evidence is intellectual integrity. The second source is social pressure. You have encountered not new evidence, but social signal, the implicit or explicit communication that your view is unacceptable to the people around you, that holding it makes you an outlier, that the cost of maintaining it is social isolation. Changing your mind in response to this is not intellectual integrity. It is compliance. The manufactured consensus technique works by flooding your environment with social signal while minimizing genuine evidence, creating the impression that everyone around you has already evaluated and concluded, and that your divergent position is not simply different, but obviously embarrassingly wrong. The defense is the ability to ask calmly, every time you feel pressure to change a position, has new information arrived? Or has social pressure arrived? They feel identical in the moment. They require completely different responses. Anatoly concluded his report with what he called the 5 conditions, the specific internal conditions that produced psychological untouchability in the subjects he had studied. Not innate conditions, not personality traits you either have or don't, constructed conditions, built through specific practices over time. Here they are, each one with its modern application. We have already discussed this in detail, but Anatoly was specific about what stable self-knowledge means in practice. It is not a fixed, final image of yourself that you defend. It is an ongoing, updating, honest record of your own character, including the contradictions, including the failures, including the parts that are still unresolved. The practical discipline Anatoly recommended was what he called the weekly reckoning, a brief, private written practice. 3 questions. Where did I act in accordance with my actual values this week? Where did I act against them? What was the specific pressure or fear that produced the gap? Not a performance for anyone else, not a public confession, a private, honest accounting, done consistently, over months. This practice does not eliminate failures. It eliminates the gaps that failures create, because a failure that has been honestly examined and acknowledged is a failure that cannot be weaponized against you. It has already been integrated into your self-knowledge. There is no shadow for the manipulation to stand in. The second condition is the developed habit of asking about every significant piece of information that enters your awareness. Where did this come from? Who produced it? What do they want from me? What emotional state does it create in me? And who benefits from me being in that emotional state? This is not paranoia. It is the baseline information hygiene that media literacy educators have been trying to build for 2 decades, but framed not as intellectual exercise, as self-defense. You are not evaluating sources because it is intellectually responsible. You are evaluating sources because someone is trying to use what you believe to manage your behavior, and knowing who is trying to do that and why is the first step toward choosing whether to let them. The practical discipline here is simple. For any piece of information that produces a strong emotional response in you, wait before sharing it, before acting on it, before letting it update your worldview. Ask the source questions. Give yourself 24 hours. In 24 hours, the emotional urgency will have moderated enough for your prefrontal cortex to do its actual job. You will still believe what is true. You will have released what was manipulation. The third condition concerns the quality of your primary social relationships. Not their warmth, not their pleasure, their integrity. Anatoly found that the most psychologically stable subjects were those who had at least 2 or 3 relationships in which genuine disagreement was not only tolerated but normalized. Not conflict for its own sake, not relationships built on friction, relationships in which the other person had demonstrated over time the willingness to tell you things you did not want to hear, and in which you had demonstrated the same. These relationships function as the most reliable external reality check available, because a person who knows you well and has no agenda related to your compliance, who has shown you that they will tell you something difficult if it is true. That person's perspective, even when it challenges yours, is worth taking seriously. They are giving you accurate information about how you appear from outside, not filtered through the agenda of a platform, a political movement, or a person who needs something from you. The manipulation techniques we have discussed all work by eliminating or discrediting these relationships. The isolation technique specifically targets them. The manufactured consensus technique makes them feel like your outlier position rather than your reality check. The love bombing technique offers a replacement for them that feels superior but is not. The most important thing you can do to protect your psychological independence is to maintain, actively and deliberately, at least 2 or 3 relationships in which genuine honesty flows in both directions. Not casual friendships. Relationships tested by actual difficulty. Relationships that have survived at least one moment of genuine disagreement. These are the relationships that the manipulation techniques cannot afford for you to have. Guard them accordingly. This condition surprised Anatoly when he first identified it. He had expected the most psychologically resistant subjects to be those who were least emotionally reactive, the cool, controlled, analytical types. What he found was the opposite. The most resistant subjects were those who had the most precise vocabulary for their own emotional states, not less emotional, more specifically emotional. They could name in detail what they were feeling. And knowing specifically what they were feeling, they could also locate where the feeling was coming from and whether the source was reliable. This matters because manipulation techniques almost universally work through emotion first. They produce a feeling, then they offer an interpretation of the feeling, and then they offer a behavioral response to the feeling, all three provided by the manipulation. The person with precise emotional vocabulary has the capacity to interrupt the sequence at the first step. They feel the feeling. They name it specifically. And in naming it, they begin the process of evaluating it independently. Rather than accepting the interpretation that arrives simultaneously with the feeling, anxiety is a feeling. But what specifically are you anxious about? What precisely does the anxiety tell you about what you believe is threatened? Is what is threatened actually threatened? Or has something created the feeling of threat without there being an actual threat? The person who can ask these questions in real time is the person whose emotions are not entirely available as manipulation instruments. Not because they don't feel, because they know what they feel, with enough precision to evaluate it. The fifth condition is perhaps the most countercultural, the most difficult to maintain in the current environment, and Anatoly found the most consistently present in the most psychologically stable subjects. They spent time alone, deliberately, regularly. Not because they were antisocial, not because they were depressed or withdrawn, because they had understood that the internal mirror requires maintenance, and maintenance requires quiet. In quiet, without the constant input of external signal, the internal mirror has the opportunity to function without interference. You hear your own thinking. You notice your own reactions. You observe what you actually feel about things, separate from what the social environment suggests you should feel. You reconnect with your own values, separate from the values the external environment has been amplifying. The modern information environment has essentially eliminated this quiet from many people's lives, not by force, by design. Every moment of potential quiet has an available, designed, immediately accessible alternative. The phone, the podcast, the background television, the constant connectivity, each of them individually harmless. Together, they constitute a complete elimination of the conditions under which the internal mirror can calibrate itself. The practice of deliberate solitude does not require dramatic withdrawal. It requires only this: some period each day, however brief, in which no external input is invited. Not meditation necessarily, not silence, just the deliberate choice to be with your own thinking rather than someone else's signal. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, during which the internal mirror has the opportunity to speak without competition. And over time, over weeks and months of this practice, the internal mirror gets louder, clearer, more stable, more able to function as the primary reference point it was designed to be. And the external mirror, however loud, however insistent, however sophisticated its engineering, becomes what it should be: one input among many, evaluated, not obeyed. Near the end of his classified report, Anatoly wrote something that his superiors later removed from the official version: a postscript, one that expressed something he apparently could not leave out, even knowing it would likely be cut. He wrote, "The techniques we have developed and refined work with devastating effectiveness on the majority of human beings. They work because they exploit genuine needs, real, legitimate, profoundly human needs. The need to be known, the need for safety, the need for community, the need for meaning. These needs are not weaknesses. They are the most important features of our species. The techniques work by inserting manufactured satisfactions between people and their genuine needs, by becoming the only available path to something real. What I have found in studying the people these techniques cannot reach is that their immunity is not the absence of need. It is the presence of genuine satisfaction of the genuine need. A person who is truly known in at least one relationship in their life cannot be effectively manipulated by the offer of counterfeit knowing. They know what the real thing feels like, and they know this is not it. A person who has genuine community cannot be easily isolated. They know what they are losing, and they refuse to lose it. A person who has genuine meaning in their life cannot be easily manufactured into a vessel for someone else's meaning. They already carry their own. The answer to what we have built is not better defenses. It is more genuine life, more real knowing, more real community, more real meaning. These things are harder to build than the techniques are to deploy, but they are the only things that work. His superiors removed the postscript. They kept the technical findings and went back to work. If you are leaving this with one thing, make it this. The psychological manipulation environment you live in today is more sophisticated, more precisely targeted, and more pervasively deployed than anything the Cold War intelligence services operated. It is not operated by one government. It is operated by hundreds of systems simultaneously, each with its own interest in your compliance, your anxiety, your dependency, or your purchasing behavior. You cannot fight all of it at once. You do not need to. You need to build 5 things. Honest self-knowledge that includes your own contradictions. The habit of asking who benefits from what you're feeling. 2 or 3 relationships in which genuine honesty flows both directions. Precise enough emotional vocabulary to name what you feel before someone else names it for you. And regular, deliberate time alone. In quiet, without input, where your own thinking has the space to be heard. These 5 things will not make you invulnerable. Nothing will make you invulnerable. But they will make you something specific. They will make you the person who sees what is happening, who pauses before responding, who evaluates before concluding, who cannot be fully run. Not because you have no needs, but because your needs are being met by something real, something they cannot manufacture, something they cannot counterfeit, something that has been tested by time and difficulty and actual knowledge. The manipulation techniques all work in the space between what you need and what is genuine. Close that space, not by eliminating the need, by filling it with something real. This is not an abstraction. Let me describe what Anatoly's resistance subjects actually look like in the room. When an interrogator began deploying the information vacuum, creating deliberate gaps, watching for anxiety to fill them, the resistance subject did something unusual. They asked for clarification. Directly, not aggressively, calmly. They said, "I don't understand what you're suggesting. Can you be more specific?" This one move disrupted the technique completely. The information vacuum works by leaving the gap undefined. The subject's imagination fills it with something worse than reality. A request for specificity forces the gap to be filled by the interrogator rather than the imagination. And the interrogator, in most cases, does not have a specific accusation ready, because the technique was not accusation. It was atmosphere. And atmosphere, when directly questioned, dissolves. The resistance subject had developed the instinct to name what was undefined, to bring it into explicit, specific language, to refuse to let it remain atmospheric. Because they knew, from their own honest self-knowledge, that the atmosphere was not about them. It was about the room, and they had no obligation to carry what the room was putting into the air. When the love-bombing technique was deployed, the sudden, overwhelming warmth, the extraordinary attention, the uncanny sense of being completely understood, the resistant subject felt it. They were not immune to the feeling. They simply noticed something specific. They noticed that they were being understood before they had been known. They noticed that the warmth arrived before the relationship had any history. And they thought, this is faster than genuine things travel. They did not withdraw. They did not become cold. They simply let time be what time is. They did not let the feeling of understanding substitute for the process of being understood. They waited to see whether the warmth was still there after disagreement, after difficulty, after the moment when genuine relationship gets tested. In every documented case, the warmth that was technique did not survive those tests. And by the time the subject noticed, they had never given anything that required trust, because they had not yet determined that trust was warranted when manufactured consensus was deployed. when the subject was surrounded by apparent agreement that their position was obviously wrong. The resistant subject did something that looked almost naive from the outside. They asked for the evidence, not confrontationally, curiously. They said, "I can see that most people seem to agree on this. Can you walk me through the evidence that convinced you?" And in the absence of genuine evidence, in the presence of only social signal, the question exposed exactly what was there. Not argument, atmosphere. And again, direct questioning dissolves atmosphere. The resistant subjects were not smarter than the others. They simply had a different reflex, where others felt social pressure and instinctively looked for the consensus position to move toward. The resistant subjects felt social pressure and instinctively looked for the underlying evidence. They had been practicing that instinct their entire adult lives, not in service of contrarianism, in service of their own genuine thinking. You can practice these reflexes. They do not require intelligence. They require repetition, the reflex of naming what is undefined rather than letting it remain atmospheric. The reflex of asking for evidence when social pressure arrives without it. The reflex of measuring warmth against time rather than against feeling. These are muscle movements, psychological ones. And like all muscle movements, they strengthen with use and weaken with disuse. You are deciding every single day whether to use them or not. Every time you pause before checking your notifications, you are building the reflex. Every time you ask who benefits from what you're feeling, you are building the reflex. Every time you spend 15 minutes alone without picking up your phone, you are building the reflex. And one day, in a moment that matters, in a conversation with someone who is trying to run you, or in front of a screen designed to produce a specific emotional state in you, you will pause and evaluate and choose. Not automatically, deliberately. And that pause, that one moment of deliberate choice between stimulus and response, is the whole difference between a person who can be run and a person who cannot. Individual psychological defense is important, but Anatoly understood something in his later years that his classified report could not contain. The individual who becomes psychologically untouchable does something beyond protecting themselves. They become a different kind of presence in their community. A reference point: the person who does not panic when the information vacuum is deployed. The person who asks for evidence when consensus is manufactured. The person who maintains genuine relationships in a social environment designed to atomize. The person who has real self-knowledge in an environment that profits from self-uncertainty. These individuals are disproportionately valuable, not because they are leaders necessarily, but because they are anchors. People around them observe the reflex, the pause, the question, the calm, and they begin to develop their own version of it. Not through instruction, through proximity to the practice. This is how genuine immunity spreads. Not through information campaigns, through the contagion of a demonstrated alternative. One person at a time, in one community at a time. Building the internal mirror, maintaining the relationships, developing the reflex, and becoming one practice at a time. Someone the techniques cannot reach. Anatoly retired in 1989. He spent the last years of his career not building better manipulation techniques, but trying to figure out how to tell people what he had found, how to get the findings out of the classified report and into the hands of the people the techniques were being used against. He did not succeed in his lifetime. He died in 2003. But the findings survived. They are in the report, and the report is in the archive, and the archive, partially, is now open. And what was built as a tool for state control of individuals has become, read correctly, a manual for how individuals escape state control of themselves. The techniques work in darkness. You are in the light now. If you stayed until the end of this, write in the comments, internal mirror, and tell us what city you're watching from. Because the work of building this does not have to be done alone. And knowing that someone in another city, another time zone, is building the same thing is itself one of the genuine things, one of the things they cannot manufacture. Theory is not enough. You need to see it in a person. Someone who lived through the pressure, who came out the other side holding the same sense of themselves they walked in with. There are documented cases, not many, but enough. In the late 1960s, a mid-level American diplomat stationed in a Soviet-adjacent posting became a target. We will call him Warren, not his name, but his case is documented in declassified counterintelligence files from the 1980s. Warren had spent 3 years at his posting when the operation against him began. The approach was standard: a cultivated contact, apparently accidental meetings, gradually increasing warmth and connection. The information vacuum technique deployed in his professional environment, subtle manufactured consensus in his social circle around specific political positions, and after 8 months, a direct approach. An offer that framed what was being asked as a small, harmless, ideologically defensible act. Warren said no. Not angrily, not anxiously. He said, "I understand what you're describing. I'm not going to do that. And I'd like to be clear that this conversation happened." And then he reported the approach to his superior the same afternoon. When investigators later debriefed him about why he had not been more susceptible, he said something worth remembering. He said, "I had spent a lot of time figuring out what I actually believed, not what my colleagues believed, not what the institution expected me to believe, what I specifically believed. And the approach they made didn't fit what I actually believed, so it wasn't a hard decision." He paused. Then he said, "The hard work had already been done." The 8 months of cultivation that the operation invested had produced nothing, because Warren had already done the foundational work of knowing himself. There was no gap for the operation to stand in, no vacuum of self-knowledge to fill with a manufactured identity. He already knew who he was, and who he was didn't collaborate. In the early 1980s, a British academic with access to sensitive research in material science became a cultivation target. The approach was through a colleague at a conference in Vienna. The colleague was not an operative. He was a genuine academic who had been compromised years earlier and was now unknowingly used as an introduction mechanism. Through the colleague, she met a man who seemed extraordinary in his attention and understanding. She described him later as the first person in her adult life who seemed to understand her without needing her to explain herself. He asked the right questions. He reflected her thinking back to her with precision. He validated not just her work, but her specific personal framework for understanding the world. She was, she later acknowledged, profoundly attracted to the relationship. But something in her slowed her down. Not suspicion exactly. She described it as a noticing. She noticed that he had no strong opinions that conflicted with hers. She noticed that when she changed her mind about something mid-conversation, he immediately appeared to agree with the new position as naturally as he had agreed with the previous one. She noticed that he seemed to understand her better after 2 meetings than people who had known her for years. And she thought, genuine understanding doesn't travel this fast. She did not pull away immediately. She was too interested for that. But she began testing, introducing positions she didn't actually hold, minor contradictions of things she had said in previous conversations. Real opinions she suspected he might find inconvenient. Each time he absorbed and agreed, he was a perfect mirror, reflecting back whatever she offered. And that, she later said, was exactly the problem. A real person has their own perspective. A real person sometimes disagrees. A real person doesn't simply reflect. She reported her concerns to her institution's security officer. The investigation that followed confirmed that the approach had been an intelligence operation. She had been the target. Her genuine self-knowledge and specifically her calibrated sense of what genuine understanding actually felt like had saved her. This case is older, from the 1950s. A skilled machinist in a manufacturing facility in Central Europe, working in a period of significant political pressure. He was not politically sophisticated. He was not an intellectual. He was a man who made precise parts for precision instruments, and who took considerable pride in his work. The local political apparatus was running a systematic program to recruit informants within the facility. The approach was pressure combined with flattery. The suggestion that he was important enough to be worth recruiting, that his cooperation would protect him and his family, that the information being asked for was minor, routine, the kind of thing that everyone was sharing. He said no. His response, as recorded in a later account of his case, was this. He said, "You are telling me that everyone is already doing this. If that's true, you don't need me. If it's not true, you're lying to me." Either way, I'm not interested. He had not studied logical reasoning. He had not studied psychology. He had simply, in that moment, asked the question that the manufactured consensus technique cannot survive. If consensus is genuine, it is self-sufficient. If it must be argued for and pressured for and presented as reason to comply, it is manufactured. And manufactured consensus has no claim on genuine conscience. He walked away. He was not arrested. The apparatus wanted informants who were willing. A man who saw through the technique and named it clearly was more trouble than he was worth. Warren knew what he actually believed. The British academic knew what genuine understanding felt like. The machinist knew how to ask the question that exposed manufactured consensus. None of them had superior intelligence. None of them had special training. None of them had access to Anatoly's classified report. They had each, through their own lives and their own practice, developed one of the 5 conditions. Warren had stable self-knowledge. The academic had calibrated relationship integrity and emotional literacy. The machinist had source awareness. And each of those single developed conditions was enough. Enough to interrupt the technique at the moment it needed to land, enough to buy the pause in which the manipulation could be seen for what it was. And once seen, it lost its power. Because none of these techniques are invincible. They are not invincible. They are effective against people who have never examined them, who have never been told their names, who have never been given the framework to evaluate them in real time. That is precisely why they have been kept from public knowledge. Not because they are impossible to defend against, because defense requires knowing they exist. You know they exist now. You know their names. You know the conditions that make them ineffective. And you know that the conditions can be built, one practice at a time, one honest accounting at a time, one genuine relationship at a time, one deliberate period of silence at a time. Abstract conditions are not enough. You need specific practices, daily ones, small enough to actually do. Here they are, before you pick up your phone in the morning, before you consume the first piece of external information, ask yourself one question. What do I actually think and feel right now? Before the day's input begins, write it down. Even one sentence. What is your current state? What concerns you? What you are looking forward to? What unresolved thing is sitting in your peripheral attention? This takes 3 minutes, and it serves one purpose. It creates a baseline, a recorded specific snapshot of your own internal state before any external system has had the opportunity to adjust it. At the end of the day, you can compare, not to judge the day's changes, but to notice them, to see which changes came from genuine experience and reflection, and which came from external signal that your emotional system absorbed without your noticing. You cannot identify the manipulation if you don't know your starting point. The morning question creates the starting point. Once a week, 15 minutes. List the 5 sources of information you have consumed most heavily in the past 7 days. For each source, ask, what does this source want from me emotionally? What behavior is it designed to produce? What would I believe or feel differently if I had not consumed this source this week? This is not about eliminating information sources. It is about maintaining awareness of what each source is doing to your internal state. An information environment you understand is an information environment you can navigate. An information environment you have never audited is an information environment that is navigating you. Monthly, or whenever you notice you have not done it in a while, review your current significant beliefs. Political ones, social ones, professional ones. Identify the 2 or 3 people in your life whose opinion you most respect. Now identify one significant belief you hold that at least one of those people disagrees with. If you cannot identify one, that is the practice. Find out what they disagree with you about, not to change your mind. To know that you have a position that is genuinely yours, that has survived the pressure test of genuine, caring disagreement. A belief that has never been tested by real opposing opinion from someone you respect. Maybe a belief, or maybe the reflection of your social environment. You cannot know which until you test it. The monthly disagreement check creates the conditions for that test. 10 minutes, every day, without a device, without audio input, without a screen, outside if possible, in your own space if not, just time with your own thinking. Not productive time, not meditation necessarily, just the deliberate choice to be with yourself. Without the constant input that prevents the internal mirror from functioning, in 10 minutes of genuine quiet, your own thinking has the opportunity to be heard. Your own values have the opportunity to surface. Your own priorities, separate from what the day has been amplifying, have the opportunity to speak. This is the simplest practice, and for many people in the current environment, the hardest, because the alternatives are always immediately available, and the alternatives are always, by design, more immediately stimulating than 10 minutes of quiet. Do it anyway. The muscle grows with use, and it is the most important muscle you have. Identify 2 people in your life with whom genuine honesty is possible. People who have told you a difficult truth at least once. People to whom you have told a difficult truth at least once. People who knew you before your current circumstances. People who will know you after your current circumstances change. Now invest in those relationships deliberately, not because they are the most stimulating, not because they are the most immediately gratifying, but because they are the most real. Because they are the relationships that cannot be manufactured, cannot be simulated, cannot be replaced by the counterfeit versions the manipulation techniques offer. These relationships are your most valuable psychological asset, more valuable than any piece of information, more valuable than any platform, more valuable than any community that exists primarily on a screen. Guard them, maintain them, show up for them even when it is inconvenient, because the moment will come when you need a reality check, when you need someone who knows you to tell you what they actually see. And in that moment, the quality of your protection will depend entirely on whether you maintain these relationships when you didn't need them yet. The techniques exist. They are running. They will continue running, not because the people deploying them are uniquely evil, but because they work. And they work because they exploit genuine needs. The genuine human need for information in an uncertain environment. The genuine human need for connection and being known. The genuine human need for community and belonging. The genuine human need for safety and protection. The genuine human need for meaning. These needs cannot be eliminated. They should not be eliminated. They are what make us capable of genuine love, genuine community, genuine meaning. But they can be met genuinely, by real information from sources evaluated rather than consumed, by real relationships tested by time and difficulty, by real community that exists in actual space with actual people, by real safety that comes from knowing yourself well enough that no one can convince you that you are something other than what you are, by real meaning that you have constructed from your own genuine reflection rather than received prepackaged from a system designed to profit from your consuming it. The manipulation techniques all work by offering counterfeits of these things, manufactured versions that feel right but don't hold, that produce dependency rather than satisfaction, that leave you always a little hungry, always a little anxious, always a little more tied to the system that produced the counterfeit. The path to becoming psychologically untouchable is not the construction of better defenses. It is the construction of genuine life, the kind that doesn't need counterfeit because the real thing is already there. That is what Anatoly found. That is what the classified report concluded. And that is what the manipulation programs have never been able to answer, because you cannot manufacture the real thing. You can only recognize it and build toward it. One practice at a time. If you made it to the very end, write in the comments, internal mirror, and tell us what city you're watching from. Because the work of building this is being done by someone else right now in a city you may never visit. And knowing that is itself one of the genuine things to understand why these psychological techniques are so effective. You have to understand where they were born, not in a secret facility, not in a classified program, in the wreckage of ordinary human suffering, and in the careful, patient observation of people trying to survive it. The 1930s in the Soviet Union were a period of extraordinary psychological pressure. The political purges of that decade did not work primarily through physical coercion. That is the common misunderstanding. They worked primarily through psychological engineering. The target of the purges was not primarily the physical body. It was the self. the individual's sense of reality, the internal mirror. Thousands of people confessed to crimes they had not committed in public with apparent sincerity. The outside world looked at these confessions and could not understand them. Some concluded that the accused must have been tortured into compliance. Some concluded that the confessions must have been genuine. Both conclusions missed the actual mechanism. What the interrogation apparatus of that period had discovered was that under sustained, precise, psychological pressure of specific kinds, a person's internal mirror could be made to show them a different image of themselves. Not through pain, through exhaustion, through information isolation, through manufactured consensus among everyone around them that they were exactly what the accusation described. Through the systematic destruction of every external relationship that might provide a reality check. Through the creation of conditions in which the only available version of reality was the one the apparatus was offering. The accused confessed because they had been made, through systematic psychological technique, to believe. Not all of them. Some held, and the ones who held were studied as carefully as the ones who broke, because the ones who held had something, some quality, some internal structure, some psychological feature that the techniques could not reach. And understanding what that was became a priority research question. That is where Anatoly's work began, not as defense, as the search for what made the system fail, and eventually, in the quiet of his own conscience, as the search for how to give that quality to more people. In the late 1940s, a team of psychologists working within the interrogation research program made a specific discovery. They had been studying the cases of subjects who had maintained psychological coherence under conditions that broke most others. They expected to find that these subjects shared some personality trait, some innate quality, something that could be selected for in recruiting and training. What they found was different. The quality the resistant subjects shared was not innate. It was practiced. It was not a feature of their original psychology. It was a product of specific habits they had developed over years. The most consistent among the resistant subjects, they had a practice of private honesty, not public righteousness, not stated principles, private honesty. The habit of sitting alone with the actual truth about their own actions, not the flattering version, not the version they would present to others, the actual version. They had integrated their own failures. They had looked at their own contradictions. And they had produced a self-image that was honest enough to be stable when the interrogation apparatus tried to insert a new, distorted image of who they were. The distorted image could not find purchase because the space where it needed to land was already occupied by something accurate, by something the subject themselves had placed there, deliberately, through practice, through years of private, honest accounting. The apparatus could not manufacture a shadow in someone who had already examined their own. This finding was classified immediately. It was considered too operationally significant to allow outside, because it implied something the program could not afford to acknowledge: that the most effective counterintelligence operation possible was not better security protocols. It was psychological self-knowledge, widely distributed among ordinary people. A population with well-maintained internal mirrors was a population the techniques could not effectively penetrate at scale, and a program that depended on psychological penetration at scale had an obvious interest in that population not developing those mirrors. The finding was buried. Anatoly found it 20 years later and spent the rest of his career sitting with what it meant. Here's the paradox Anatoly identified. The techniques require enormous resources, sophisticated personnel, operational infrastructure, time, money, continuous maintenance. The defense requires none of those things. The defense requires only this: the individual practice of self-knowledge, maintained privately, daily, with no equipment, no institution, no permission. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is one of the fundamental features of psychological self-defense. The attack is always more expensive than the defense. The manipulation requires everything. The resistance requires only the consistent practice of being honest with yourself, in private, in quiet, over time. That is the full extent of what is required, and what the program discovered and immediately suppressed was that this one practice, widely adopted, makes the entire apparatus unnecessary. Not reduces its effectiveness, makes it unnecessary, because you cannot manipulate a person who knows themselves better than you know them. You cannot manufacture their reality when they are already accurately perceiving it. You cannot create a shadow in someone who has sat with their own darkness long enough to know its shape. The specific apparatus that Anatoly worked within no longer exists in the form it did, but the techniques it developed and the discovery about their defeat that it suppressed both survived. The techniques are now deployed at a scale that would have been science fiction in Anatoly's era, not by one government, by hundreds of commercial and political systems simultaneously, each with its own version of the information vacuum, its own version of manufactured consensus, its own version of the empty mirror, its own version of gradual commitment and love bombing and identity disruption, all running simultaneously, all using the same underlying architecture, all exploiting the same genuine human needs, at a precision and scale that the original program never achieved. And the suppressed discovery has also survived. It survived in the practices of people who figured it out independently, people who developed their own versions of the private honesty practice, who maintained their own versions of the relationships that survived difficulty, who developed their own versions of the emotional vocabulary that names what is felt before someone else names it. These people are not immune, but they are significantly, measurably, demonstrably more resistant. And in a world running the techniques at the scale that this world is running them, significantly more resistant is the difference between a person who is run and a person who runs themselves. The work is not finished. It will never be finished. The techniques evolve, new versions emerge, new platforms create new points of access, new forms of manufactured consensus use new mechanisms, new versions of the empty mirror appear in new contexts. The specific practices that build resistance must evolve with them, but the foundational principle does not change. The foundational principle that Anatoly identified in his classified report and that the program buried because it was too dangerous to acknowledge does not change. Know yourself, honestly, with your contradictions integrated, with your shadow examined, with your failures faced rather than buried. Know what genuine connection feels like, so you can recognize the counterfeit. Know your own emotional vocabulary, so you can name what you feel before someone else names it for you. Know who benefits from your specific fear, your specific compliance, your specific dependency, and maintain the relationships that tell you the truth. These things together, in daily practice, small, consistent, private, make you the person the techniques cannot reliably reach. Not untouchable in some superhuman sense, but untouchable in the sense that matters. Untouchable enough to pause, to see, to choose, rather than to be chosen for. That is what Anatoly found. That is what his report concluded. That is what was suppressed. And now you know it. Write internal mirror in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Because the practice of building this is already underway. In your city, in the next city, in cities you will never visit, in the quiet moments of ordinary lives, of ordinary people who decided to know themselves, and in deciding that, decided something about the world.